So it's my pleasure today to introduce Geoff Zeiss. Geoff is the Director of Technology at Autodesk. Geoff has an extensive background in the applicability of the enterprise solutions of geospatial information Web 2.0. So with that, I'd like to ask Geoff to come up and look forward to his presentation. Geoff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. I'm very glad to be here, especially British Columbia, which I used to live here 8 years and is really a remarkable place. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the really interesting things that are happening in geospatial, because geospatial, I would say this is probably the most exciting period that I can remember in this, and I've been in geospatial since about 1981. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on there, what I've been calling geospatial inflection point. Then I'm going to just give a little introduction to a concept called convergence. Well, you've probably heard of convergence in the context of television and telephone and so on and so forth, but I'm going to be talking about a little bit different kind of convergence. And I'm going to talk about open geospatial standards from organizations like the OGC. Concept of commoditization, why this is important for open source and why this is really helping open source geospatial develop as rapidly as it has. Then I'm going to try to relate this to something very concrete in the utility industry. I know we'll bring in a little bit of Web 2.0 stuff. And then talk just about some of the folks that who have been actually building the open source geospatial industry in Canada and around the world. So, I don't know if you recognize this, but this is the Burj Dubai. This picture was taken last week, and it was 140 floors at that point. It's going to go up to over 176 floors. They're not telling anybody how high it's going to go because there's another consortium, Dubai, who's already planning a building that's going to be higher. Being the highest building these days gives you about 3 years before somebody comes up with something high. This building is going to be almost 930 meters. And I don't know why they really, I wouldn't be surprised if they go to a full kilometer because that'll be in the Guinness Book of Records forever. But what's happening in construction is similar to what's happening in geospatial, and that is just everything is changing. This is, I think, something that most people are aware of. I arbitrarily stuck 2005, 2006 on there because I was at a geotech conference about that time a few years ago, and it seemed like every speaker mentioned the concept of geospatial enabling. What this means is that we're no longer in a little puddle doing GIS things. We're now finding that geospatial enabling is showing up everywhere. And if you've been anywhere on the web using Google, you've seen it. There are 200 million people who have downloaded Google Earth, and Google Earth is not a small download. Michael Jones is going to give a presentation tomorrow. The last time I was at a conference with him, and he gave a presentation, and he compared it to the populations of the most populous countries in the world, and if you look at the number of people who've downloaded geospatial, it's about 5th after China, India, US, and Indonesia. The other thing that's exciting is what's called Web 2.0. A lot of people don't know what Web 2.0 was actually coined by Tim O'Reilly, and I was just at OSCON in Portland yesterday, and that's a really exciting conference. But Web 2.0, if you know that Wikipedia is probably the best example of Web 2.0, then I'm sure everybody knows what Web 2.0 is. The key thing about Web 2.0 is it's user-provided content. It's not a bunch of guys sitting in universities in the UK writing the Encyclopedia Britannica. This is user-developed content. There was an article in Nature, which is a serious academic journal, that actually very favorably compared Wikipedia as far as breadth and depth to the Encyclopedia Britannica. So this is a serious source of information. Time magazine last year, instead of choosing a diplomat or somebody, an author or whatever, chose you because of the web enabling. You've probably all experienced Google Earth. As I said, there's been 200 million downloads. This was several months ago. It's probably larger than that now. And actually 10,000 mashups. These are applications that folks have developed. And this was before my map. And of course, Web 2.0, which I think really symbolized the biggest change in this industry, it happened about 3 years ago, I think the first one, and now is happening every year since then. So the important thing is that the world is changing, and geospatial is now being used by more people than ever before, most of whom have no idea what GIS stands for. The other thing that's interesting that relates to what we'll talk about today is OGC standards. The OGC used to be called the OpenGIS. Now symbolically it's called Open Geospatial Consortium. And these are some of the most widely known standards. The simple feature spec, which I think has really motivated a lot of folks, PostGIS, for example, but all the major database manufacturers and vendors, for example, support it now. The geographic markup language, which Galdos has been really in the forefront of developing, and the OGC web services, web mapping, and web feature. People may not know very much about what the SQL support for spatial extensions, but ISO has developed something called SQLMM, which does support geospatial extensions. And the thing that we'll talk about a bit today, quite a bit today, is open source geospatial. This is actually a very interesting phenomenon. I think most of us were unaware of it until about a year. For me, it was until about a year and a half ago when I discovered just how big the open source geospatial community had become. It's interesting because one of the open source projects, MapServer, which was originally developed at the University of Minnesota, was taken over by a company in Ottawa called DM Solutions. Not taken over, but has been maintained. Most of the work on it has been done by that company in Ottawa. And some people now believe that half of the world's web mapping servers actually use MapServer, which is, as I said, open source. I was just at OSCON down in Portland, and these are some of the O'Reilly titles. I think you'll probably, if you know anything about open source, you'll recognize some of the names here. Tyler Mitchell actually lives in British Columbia, in Williams Lake. And I saw him Monday actually here, because we gave basically an introduction to some open source web mapping applications. Skylar Earle, who is in the US, Joe Walsh. I think you'll recognize most of these names if you're familiar with the open source community. The other thing that I want to get into a bit, which I think is really going to change the world in a major way, is BIM CAD GIS convergence. BIM means Building Information Modeling. That is basically the latest technology for developing architectural designs for buildings. CAD, I'm sure you're all familiar with, and GIS, I'm sure you're also familiar with. But this is really going to change things, and I'm going to give you some numbers to give you some idea of why this is so critical. First of all, the worldwide construction spend is $2.3 trillion per year. 1.2 trillion of that is in the U.S. Canada, in $97 is about 68 billion, so it's probably much larger than that now. But this is a lot of money, and that's the sole purpose for showing you this slide. There's a lot of money that goes into construction every year, but there's some major things that are happening in this area. First of all, global climate change is really going to change how we build buildings. And it means a lot of our existing buildings are going to have to be restructured, redesigned, or replaced. Aging infrastructure is a massive problem in North America. The Association of Civil Engineers in the U.S. prepares a scorecard every 2 years. 5 years ago, they gave roads and highways in the U.S. a grade of D+. Last 2 years ago, they gave it a grade of D. If you put it in the context of 40,000 fatalities every year in the U.S., and some people say that 1/3 of those are at least partially due to bad road conditions, you can see what the impact of bad roads is. This is not just a question of potholes. The other thing that's really, I think, a major problem for utilities and telcos is something called the aging workforce. There was a study done in the U.S. In the power industry in 2004. That was 3 years ago. Found that 50% of the utility workforce is over 45. Now, a lot of these people are near 50. I sat next to somebody at a conference recently from Public Works in Arizona who told me that half of his field force could leave this year, could retire this year. What this means is a massive loss of information about networks. This is going to have implications for safety. It's going to have implications for productivity.